This is Real Talk, the Customer Insights Show with Jenn Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We're live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Join Jenn and her guests for this live discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Also available on podcast channels. This live stream is presented to you by Vox PopMe, the leader in video research and ranked #1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's live conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm Jenn Vogel. Today, we're going to talk about how insights teams help companies drive innovation. And to help me dive into this topic, I'm joined by Nick Graham, Global Head of Insights and Analytics at Mondelez International. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hi. Well, there I am.
There
so
you
excited
are.
to be with you today. I'm sorry we couldn't actually be physically in person. That was would have been very exciting, but I'm glad to be virtually here.
For those of you listening, we were planning to do our very first live in-person Real Talk episode, and of course it didn't work out.
Of course. No, because nothing in the last 2 years was going to work out, right?
Nothing ever goes as planned. But I'm thrilled to have you here virtually.
Likewise. Well, it's maybe another time we can get together in rural Connecticut somewhere and do the show.
It's a good plan. So yeah, let's kick off and get started. I'd love to have you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your career, where you've come from, and your role at Mondelez.
Absolutely. Well, excited to be here. What can I tell you about my career? So I've been in this new role at Mondelez for the last 6 months. It's amazing how time has flown over the last couple of months. Prior to that, I was 8 years at PepsiCo, and then prior to that, most of my prior life was in brand innovation consulting, but always with qualitative, quantitative research at the heart of it. As you can tell, I'm originally from the UK, born and raised in the UK. And then spent the last 11 years living in the US, which, again, I don't know where 11 years of my life went. I moved to the US to help open M&C Saatchi's brand innovation consultancy over here. You know, it was meant to be a few years, and here we are, 11 years later, 3 jobs later. That's what life is, right? It never quite goes to how you originally thought it was going to happen. And so in my role here at Mondelez, I lead a team running insights and analytics across the entire business. So that kind of runs the gamut from, using insights, foresights to spot opportunities, right the way through developing brand innovation, through to validating and understanding performance in markets. So yeah, it's a real privilege to do that role, and real privilege to be here today.
Yeah. That's an exciting move. What was that like, kind of making that leap from 8 years at Pepsi to leading this team at Mondelez?
Well, it's funny because in many respects, there's a lot of similarity because another big, CPG company. And it's funny kind of coming to Mondelez, everybody in the team thinks that the challenges that a business faces are very unique to it. It's the whole sort of old adage about each family thinks it has its own challenges, when in fact there are just a lot of commonalities between the two companies as big CPGs. I think the biggest thing is just getting used to the culture of the company. I think that's the biggest difference as I look at as Mondelez and PepsiCo. And so just getting to know people, getting to know the culture, getting to understand actually how things operate and how things operate in reality versus on paper, because often that's the unspoken, ways of working, rules of the road that you don't know about when you come straight into a company. I was a little nervous about kind of joining a company in the middle of all of this, given not being able to meet people physically and understand that culture up close and personal. But actually, surprisingly, that's not been as difficult as I thought, perhaps partly because I'm in a global role. And so to a certain extent, it was always going to be somewhat virtual. And actually, because everybody's virtual, there's a good leveling effect because everybody is remote in some way, shape or form. But no, it's been a great experience. It's just, every day is a bit of a roller coaster because that's the first year in any new role, right? You're learning, you think, oh, I've got it. I understand now how things operate. And then you're like, oh, nope, no idea. Nope, nobody explained this to me. No idea how this works. So, but I was ready after 8 years at Pepsi. I was ready for a new challenge, and yeah, this is exactly the right challenge. It's exactly what I needed.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. I totally relate, like that roller coaster. Anytime I've kind of started in a new role, I kind of have this expectation that like I'll pick up on everything by like 2-3 weeks, right? And then you're like 6, 8, 9, a year into it, and you're like, there's still stuff I'm figuring out and learning. And
absolutely, I mean, 8 years at PepsiCo, there was still teams I was meeting, people I was meeting, bits of the business. You're like, oh, I didn't know you existed. Okay, well, that's good. And I mean, in all big companies, big companies or small companies that are evolving, like it's a constant change, right? So I remember even my 8 years at PepsiCo, I moved roles a couple of times, and each time I did, it felt like you were joining a completely different company in some respects, right? So the ability to keep evolving and growing and learning is honestly, it's a big reason why I get up in each morning, is the challenge of learning something new. And so certainly from that perspective, starting a new job, again, particularly in the midst of this craziness, has definitely fulfilled against that ambition.
Yeah, I bet. Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Mondelez brands and kind of the brands that you're working with. Um, when you're thinking about insights, I mean, you talked about hinted at some of the different types of insights that the team is focused on. Like, where do you start when looking at what your insight strategy is for all the different brands that you're supporting?
Well, that is a big question. So I'll try and boil it down. Otherwise, we could be the next 40 minutes just talking about that question. So, I mean, I think fundamentally it's kind of finding that right balance between the sort of inside out and outside in view when it comes to using insights. So what I mean by that is there's obviously a huge part of the role of the insights team is to bring that outside perspective, the consumer, the shopper, the category, the competitive landscape, so that we're sort of breaking outside of our mental silo, which is usually very much focused on what the business needs, what the brand needs. Having said that, I think if you just do that part, you miss the opportunity. You miss the fact that fundamentally you work for a business. It does have constraints. It has internal goals. It has internal parameters and constraints. And so I think the most successful use of insights is finding that right balance. So it starts with really understanding what the business problem is, what the brand problem is. What are we really trying to do here, and what are the parameters and constraints that we need to work within? I mean, I think a lot of times when you're looking at product and packaging innovation, what I've seen too often is, we bring what does the consumer need, what does the shopper need, but if we don't do it with the knowledge of what our constraints are, what our profitability constraints are, etc., you can end up creating something that can't possibly be executed on, or can't possibly be executed on easily. But equally, if you just constrain yourself to what is possible and don't think about what the consumer and shopper really needs, you can create something that works internally but doesn't work for the consumer and the shopper. So I think it's just about finding the right balance between those two perspectives. And I think that's where I think insight really can be used to create that competitive advantage. If you're able to harness both pieces of that, I think that's the critical part there. And so, I mean, I think really it starts with understanding the business, understanding the brand problem, and then turning that into what is the consumer or shopper problem to solve. So actually, zooming out a little bit to say, if we're looking for a new growth opportunity in a new category for one of our brands, it's very tempting to just go, how do I take my brand into that space, as opposed to asking the question of, if the brand were to go into this space, what actually is the consumer or the shopper missing in this particular category? What role could this brand fulfill? And then obviously you find the balance between those two. But I think it really is then translating it into that kind of consumer shopper mindset, and kind of going in with some hypotheses as well, right? So, I think sometimes as insights people, we want to be pure and go, no, don't tell me, just let me explore the landscape. But actually, I think it is really important to kind of go in with some hypotheses of either where we think we want to dig, where we think there might be a barrier that the consumer might have, or we think there might be a problem or an opportunity. And at least let's understand and validate those or disprove those as we go through the process. And I think the other key in all of this is how you use the blend of different sources and approaches that we have, like a truly sort of multimodal approach. So I think gone are the days when it was, let's just go and do qualitative research, or let's just go and do quantitative research. I mean, obviously now we have such a huge array of data at our disposal, from social data, big data, all the behavioral data analysis that we have from different sources, and the qualitative research as well, to really understand, the depth of what's going on behind it. So I think it's sort of the blending of those different data sources, the data science, the human science together, that I think is, to me, is often then the unlock in that is kind of what people say, what you're observing, what people are thinking, a little bit deeper into, maybe what's driving that. And that's kind of the key to unlocking what the opportunity could be.
Mm-hmm. That could be a topic all on its own, the whole show, all the access to data. I mean, this has been a theme of the last, I don't know how many years, just access to more and more different data sources. And like you mentioned, social data and behavioral data, and how to manage all of that stuff. I saw somebody posted on LinkedIn a poll, like, do you think more data is better for the insights industry or not? Which I think is an interesting question of like.
What was the answer?
I don't know. Is there an answer to that? Like, I think exactly what you said. Like, it's not the access to all of that data that's better or worse for the industry. It's like what you do with it.
Right, 100%. I mean, I think that's one of the things that has frustrated me a little bit in the last couple of years is the obsession with data and big data and data science. I mean, of course, you can't get away from that, and of course, that's a critical unlock for our industry. What frustrates me a little bit is where we think that's the be all and end all, or that's an end in itself. Like, if I have more data, I have the AI, ML, data science capabilities to be able to analyze that data at speed. Great. But then what do I do with that? And how do I make that actionable? And how do I make that meaningful for the business? And to me, that's the bit that if we forget that piece, then you can just have more data. But actually what ends up happening, I see this in the business every day, is more data can actually just slow you down, ironically, because it just creates more noise, more stuff that you have to comb through, more things that you have to make sense of. So it really is how you turn that into meaning. And that to me is where, again, we can't lose sight of the bit that feels not so trendy anymore, which is the understanding people bit, which to me is fundamentally why we do this job. Is you have to understand what's actually driving the data that you're seeing. What is the human, unspoken or spoken, what is the human need, motivation behind all of that? And if you can find that and then pair it with the data science, to me, that's the powerful combination that will really help make it meaningful, to unlock meaning from the data.
Right. And as you mentioned before, like, where does the human problem or the consumer problem intersect with your business problem that you're trying to solve? And being able to find that balance, as you were talking about in the beginning, seems like actually a pretty hard job. Like, what is that balance, right? And I'm sure you're kind of pulling in either direction,
right,
every day.
And I think it's because it's a bit of an iterative journey, right? Particularly as you think about innovation. I think whatever type of innovation, product, package, marketing innovation, it is an iterative journey, and so that sort of push and pull between the sort of the business side and the outside, whether that's the consumer or the shopper, I think is natural. I mean, it's a natural part of the innovation process. I remember a few years ago doing some work on how you integrate sort of the design thinking into the innovation process, and inherently that shows that innovation is actually like this, right? It's not a linear process. It's this constant back and forth, and you're like, we've learned this from the consumer and the shopper. How do we then apply that to the business problem? Oh, the business constraints actually are different, or actually we can't go down that path. Okay, so then let's understand from this. Let's go back to the consumer or the shopper and understand where would that take us. And I think as long as you're comfortable with that, actually the push and pull should be a natural part of the innovation process.
Yeah. Well, and with such a kind of iterative process, as you mentioned, like anything that's going to bog you down or slow you down is going to hurt that iteration, right? Like that you need the ability to be able to dig into the data and talk to the consumers and kind of have that multimodal approach throughout the whole process. What's, I guess, your experience working at such large CPGs, like the innovation cycles can be quite long to bring new products to market. How does that kind of jive with what you're seeing from competition and these kind of smaller emerging companies that are able to innovate really quickly with probably a lot fewer resources?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, we have a Colab startup, so we have a Snack Futures division, which is really about not only helping the business stretch into new ventures and new categories, but also actually we have this Colab startup program, which is actually aimed to help startups in the food and snacking industry and help bring the sort of the best of big and small together, if that makes sense. And it truly is a partnership. Yes, Mondelez is helping these 12 startups by giving them access to a lot of the ways we think about how we do insights, how we do innovation. But at the same time, we're also learning from them and trying to apply some of the ways that they think about go to market, how they think about iterative test and learn. And so I think it truly, both sides can learn from each other. And I think the power is when you can take some of the mentality of that side of startup world, which is like, truly and really intuitively understanding your consumer and what the problem is that you're solving for, quickly getting something out into the marketplace that you can actually learn with and constantly sort of iterating as you go. If you can take some of that mindset, but then apply it at scale, which is exactly what we're trying to do, to me, that's a really powerful opportunity that really, I think, is what is what we're trying to push forward as with Mondelez, is trying to do much more of that test and learn, much more of that agile, iterative process, and learn as we go. But it is a big mindset shift because it's not the way that traditionally big CPG companies operated, right? It was very much like, plan this thing, we're going to launch it in 18 months' time, we're going to launch it at scale, we're going to go. Yeah. And this requires a different reset across different parts of the business. But you see it already in lots of different parts of the team, both from product packaging, is how do we start to get things into the marketplace and learn as we go. And I think that feels very much where, particularly as you're stretching into new categories or new spaces, that feels very much where the future of innovation is going to be. If only also because we've seen over the last 2 years, right, the world is not easily predictable. And so we have to be dynamic and we have to flex and we have to be able to move quickly. We have to be able to pivot. And so some of those skills and behaviors, that's also what you learn through a more agile, iterative testing methodology. It kind of also just, to me, goes back to what we talked about, which is the innovation process is this constant iterative cycle. Mm-hmm. I think the idea that, you're going to go through, unless it's something you really know incredibly well, like, we're doing a new flavor of Oreo and you know exactly what we're making, and it's just, we're like, great, get it out, let's get on to the next thing. I think, whenever it's a little bit more complex or a little bit more risky, or the exact bundle that you're creating isn't clear, I think you do need to kind of iterate and learn as you go. So the best way that you really build something.
Well, if you ever need a taste tester for a new flavor of Oreo, my 5-year-old is your biggest fan.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, that's his favorite breakfast food is Oreos.
I can't say I will encourage that, of course, but
I try not to, but sometimes you can't help it. But yeah, I think that the way that you guys kind of have these internal, like, incubation, really entrepreneurial programs going is it's really cool for something like a company that large to be innovating in a really agile way. I had a great chat with Matt Landon from Perfect Snacks maybe like 2 years ago about just exactly this. Perfect Snacks, I don't know if they went through the Colab program, but I know they are a part of Mondelez. and just his kind of description of how they're sort of scrappy innovation techniques and working closely with Mondelez on getting the resources and the expertise from a larger company, but also being able to be what he described as scrappy.
I think that's right. I mean, I think having spent when I was in consulting, spent a lot of my time in small businesses. So when I came to PepsiCo and Mondelez, it was my first experience of large businesses, and I think there is a lot there's a lot that both sides can learn from one another, because I think being in a small business or a startup, one of the things is you do kind of reach this point where the scrappiness isn't enough, and if you're going to scale, you need to understand like what's the right infrastructure, what's the right how do I really understand my audience beyond what I know intuitively from what I used in order to build up this first version of the product, etc. And how do I have the infrastructure to then make this bigger, to scale the production processes, etc. And so I think there's a lot that our startup partners can learn, and we can impart to them about what we know about business model, about go to market. But particularly, one of the things is how to deal with our customers as well, and how to get the best out of that relationship. Again, many of them don't necessarily have some of that experience, and so that's a huge value add that we can bring to them. And then again, as you say, equally, I think what we can learn is that, and again, I think a lot of us have it intuitively. But it's a really powerful reminder of the value of being scrappy and being agile and being able to iterate in the moment. Mm-hmm. I remember one of the best projects that I ever did was we were developing a new cereal product from my last company, and we sat for 2 weeks it was a cross-functional team: design, innovation, insights, marketing, R&D, and we literally sat for 2 weeks. We spent time with shoppers and consumers. We created the prototypes of the products. We tested them with consumers. We iterated them again. And just in 2 weeks, what you were able to achieve, because you just focused on it and you learned as you went, and you were like, oh, actually, the consumers don't like this direction, but what about if we put this particular nut or ingredient into it, and then let's try that out again. Oh, that changed their expectations, and you change the concept. So this constant iterative process, if you can just focus, it feels hard work, but it can get you so much further, so much faster.
That's a really interesting concept of just like get rid of everything else and for 2 weeks just focus on this one thing. I've heard some other companies doing something similar. I know Anheuser-Busch has an innovation week every year. Mm-hmm. Just 1 week of exactly that: consumer insights and innovation, and coming up with their plans for the year. And I love like kind of co-creating with the consumer as you go, right. Rather than making the decisions for them and finding out later stage actually they don't want this, or maybe they want something a little different. Like them being part of the process really
right
is part of the experience.
And to me, it's kind of. It also speaks to, I think, where the future of insights is going to lie in terms of, I think this mentality of, I get consumer input at the end, I then go off and develop something, and then I just come back and validate it with them. To me, not only feels a little laborious, time-consuming, and a little bit reductive somehow, I think, but you then means you're very much always sort of looking backwards to like, well, they did like it, okay, great, okay. To me, the power of the more iterative approach is actually learning and looking. It's like learning to jump forwards. You're constantly learning, going, what can I do next right now? Too often when you're validating, you're like, well, at that point, what can I do differently right now, given the time constraints I have, or the capacity or production constraints that I have? Whereas actually learning in the moment and learning in a kind of more test and learn way means like, oh, like, okay, so I can then go and iterate on this, change this, and then next week we can go and try something different. So to me, it's a very different approach to doing insights work, which is more like the opportunity spotting, looking forward approach, as opposed to this sort of like just explaining what consumers want right now, or what they wanted last week, or whatever it was.
Yeah. I like that sort of more forward-looking approach and mindset of what are people looking for, as opposed to what did they think about this So, I mean, you talked about the sort of 2-week experience, but on a day-to-day, I don't think you get to have that 2-week innovations cycle all the time. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, but in your sort of typical day-to-day, like how does your function, how does Insights support innovation, both on the kind of bigger Mondelez side and through the Colab and Snack Futures and all the different areas?
So I think the sort of overall structure works very similarly depending on whichever part of the business we're talking about, whether at a global level, a business unit level, sort of in the more traditional part of the business versus Snack Futures. It all operates in a very similar way, which I think the role of Insights is kind of threefold. One is helping define where and how to play in the first place, right? So, a big part of what our job is to look at how consumers are consuming the categories today, how they're shopping the categories, learning from our foresights team about how those trends are changing over time, how people's needs and attributes are changing over time, like what are the ingredients, packaging attributes, product attributes that they're looking for in the future, what's happening in adjacent categories that we can learn from. So it really starts by sort of understanding of like, where do we want to play in this landscape? Where does the brand or the category want to play? What is it that consumers and shoppers need today, and what could they possibly, want and need in future? So almost kind of creating the brief to then build the innovation idea or the packaging idea off of in the first place. And it always makes me think, I think it's such a critical part of the process, and often gets a little bit too concertina because people are so desperate to start building. But to me, really defining what the problem is and what the opportunity area could look like, I think is so important in making sure that then you don't waste time building the wrong package innovation, product innovation, whatever it is. And then you learn about that later in validation, right? Kind of goes back to what we said before, is really getting the brief right in the first place is absolutely critical. And I think that's where Insights plays such an important role in really shaping up what consumers and shoppers need. I think that whole process has been a little bit stigmatized because people say, well, consumers can't tell you what they want, right? And that's right. I mean, they can't tell you what to go and build. They can tell you what their needs and desires are. The whole famous quote about, if we'd asked people in 1900 what it is they wanted, they would have said faster horses, not cars. To me, it's so dumb as an analogy, because I'm like, well, of course they would have done, because they didn't know that cars existed. But they could tell you they wanted to go faster. They could have told you some of the things that they were comfortable with, not comfortable with. So you could have built the idea for a car from that. But sort of assuming that consumers will just, ready-made hand you the innovation idea, to me is a bit crazy. So I always, whenever I see that analogy or somebody kind of quotes that as a reason why you shouldn't do insights or market research, makes me go a little insane, because I'm like, I think you're completely missing the point here about that actually the germ of the insight is absolutely there in the example you're using. Mm-hmm. So I think really defining what the problem is, what the opportunity is, what are the pain points that the consumer or shopper has, what are the pleasure points, like what matters to them in the journey or the product experience versus what doesn't. I think all of that is absolutely a critical part. And then, as we talked about, I think the second piece is then the role that we play in terms of helping build the idea, optimize the idea, whether that's, in a more test and learn environment where we're going out into the marketplace. So this is a lot of what our Snack Futures team are doing, is literally living what we talked about in terms of almost like that startup mentality of taking products out into the marketplace, testing them with consumers with a hypothesis in mind, right? So we think the packaging might not be quite right, so let's put it out to the marketplace. Let's understand. We think the pricing, is it too high? Is it too low? Let's try different pricing and learn as we go. Or whether it's in a slightly more classic way, which is more sort of that, okay, let's test the concept, let's build the product against that, and then let's validate that before we go into market. So really understanding through the journey how to make the best product or package possible to deliver against that original brief. Mm-hmm. And I think the most important thing, then the third piece, which can't ever be neglected, is then once you get into market, whether that's in a test and learn or whether that's a more traditional launch, is learning what's working, what's not working, optimizing where you can, but then also reapplying those learnings. I mean, too often I've seen innovation ideas, they get sort of like they didn't quite work for some reason in the marketplace. And then it's like, oh, well, that idea completely failed. When in fact, actually, usually there's a really good reason why something didn't work, whether because the product didn't quite live up to people's expectations. Maybe we didn't really articulate the messaging right, so people didn't really know what they were buying, or maybe we didn't execute it exactly in terms of how we'd originally anticipated. But learning exactly where it's formed down, not having the fear to we shouldn't be afraid of actually interrogating that and really understanding that, so we can then apply those learnings. Because too often great innovation ideas that don't work just kind of get thrown in the trash, like, okay, well, that was a dumb idea, that's never going to work. But actually sometimes the best ideas, we just didn't quite nail them the first time around. So it's really important we learn from that, so we can reapply those learnings either to that innovation or another innovation in the future.
Interesting. Yeah, that's what I was actually going to ask, is do you reapply those learnings to that innovation? Do you relaunch, to iterate while it's in market? Or is it more often that it's those learnings are being applied to the next piece of innovation?
A combination, right? So I think there are some times when, I mean, again, when you're doing more of a test and learn, you can literally iterate in market because the whole intention is to iterate in market in the first place. If it's a more kind of classic launches, what can I optimize in terms of maybe from an execution standpoint, right? Maybe I can't fix the product in market, but I can do things like pricing, the way that we message and communicate about the product. So there are things we can do to optimize in market if we can, using the intel that we have, the real-time intel we have about how the product's doing in market, like what can we learn from that, and then what could we potentially go and just try something else in the market to see if we can optimize this in real time. And then again, just as critically, is like there are plenty of occasions where a particular innovation didn't deliver against our expectations. So then let's learn from that, because that is the classic case of innovation, right? Some things will succeed, not everything is going to succeed. And so what do you learn from that and then apply that back to another opportunity? Is like, again, trying to understand through the kind of consumer experience, like where did it fall down? Was it the concept? Was it the product? Was it messaging? Was it the product or package delivery? But all of those are just key pieces to understand, where to fix the connection with the shopper or the consumer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Has there ever been an innovation that really surprised you, either underperformed or overperformed in market after, all the research that you're doing leading up to the launch? You should theoretically have a pretty good idea of how it's going to perform. But obviously we know people don't always do what they say they're going to do or shop the way they describe. And, has there ever been one that like just really surprised you one way or the other?
I think there's a couple of examples. I think one of the interesting ones for me in my last job was the whole mid-calorie piece in soda. So, for generations, both Pepsi and Coke had been trying to innovate around the sort of the sweet spot between it's not diet, but it's not full calorie. It's a really interesting example of where, if you listen to consumers, when you test the idea, they will say that they want that, right? Because it sounds perfect, right? It's like it's the taste of regular soda, but not as many calories. The interesting thing is, I think if you looked at I remember being in a focus group in New Jersey, and we had loads of quantitative data back about it was an idea that we didn't fully launch in the end, but we had all the quantitative data back that said there was an opportunity here. But I remember just being in a focus group with consumers, and you could just see that they weren't that excited about it, right? They just weren't that engaged. And to me, and they were like, yeah, no, it sounds like a great idea. But I was like, I don't believe it. And it's not that they were lying. It was just that I think it was a good example of where it felt like something they should like, because conceptually it completely delivered against what people said that they wanted. But you could just see there was no enthusiasm. And actually, as we dug into it, it was really interesting. It was a good example of where consumers, in this case, either wanted the real taste of soda, or they wanted no calories. They didn't really want something in between. It was kind of one of those things where the thing in between felt like a good idea, but actually wasn't that such a good idea in reality. And so to me, it was the lack of success of all of those sort of mid-calorie sodas, to me, wasn't entirely surprising. Like, I think it was a surprise if you looked at, again, just purely the quantitative data. You would have said, oh, this is a surprise. Like, we thought this was going to be so much bigger. Yeah. But to me, it actually just doesn't surprise me because, again, to me, it goes back to that, looking at all of your different data points. One of the data points is just watching people's reaction, their facial expressions, their body language as you're talking about it. Like, I could have told you at that point, this wasn't going to be such a big and such an exciting idea. So to me, that's an example, again, of where try to actually get out and see people reacting to this thing and talking about this thing was just as important, in fact, more important than reading whatever the quantitative data would have told you.
Right. Yeah, the combination of the two are really, like, you can't have one without the other. Like,
right.
That one focus group wouldn't have given you enough information either.
Right.
The quant data, right? But having those two together is really where a lot of the magic happens.
Exactly, yeah, and I think that's where it's as you say, it's really the balance of those pieces. You know, no one should make huge decisions off of meeting one consumer or going to one focus group, but I think it was a really good example of where just relying on quantitative data, you would have gotten to the wrong decision, I think.
Right. Totally. So one of the things you talked about is, when you're kind of trying to define that white space and, what are consumers looking for? You talked a little bit about working with the Foresights team, which I imagine these days is like the most like coveted team. Like, everybody wants to know what's happening in the future. Because I think it's still so uncertain in a lot of areas.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask you that same question. What's ahead for the future? Where do you, what kind of trends are you seeing happening in insights right now?
So I think, Foresights is a big part of that. To your point, I think, it's part of a bigger shift, I think, in the insights industry from this sort of focus on explaining, diagnosing, describing what's happening right now, or validating whatever the idea is that we've developed, to spending much more time thinking about what the future could hold, where consumers and shoppers might be. And to your point, there's no certainty in that. But what you can get to is good probabilities, good hypotheses, good scenarios that you can play out, right? So understanding what would happen if this was the future direction of travel. Mm. And so I think a big part of how we're trying to build turn insights really into a force for competitive intelligence for the business and competitive advantage is by focusing much more on foresight and using the power of all of the data that we have and the incredible foresights capabilities that the team have built to really look into the future and say, what is possible? What are we seeing that's trending? What do we think is going to stick versus what do we think is going to be more of a fad? And using that to really harness our innovation process and fuel it. And then I think, to your point, to what we've just been talking about, so kind of foresight is one part, but then the agility is the other piece, which is how do we, and this isn't just about as we talked about, isn't just about the insights process, but like, how do we move them from this very conceptual, kind of linear, somewhat sort of purist process to being one that's much more real-time, iterative, kind of testing and learning, testing in real life. How do we move much more into that mindset? Because then that allows you to really act upon the foresights more quickly. So you might know, we might know there's a really interesting opportunity in a particular ingredient or a particular category. We can develop concepts, we could develop products, we could go and test it in the traditional way, but also we could actually go and build something, or, again, with our Snack Futures team, let's go and try something sooner rather than later and actually learn in real life, is there a real opportunity in this space? What does it look like? What's the right balance of, message and ingredients and all of these pieces? And so I think, to me, the combination of foresight, but then the agility to move quickly, to act upon it and to test it in a real life environment, I think will be a really big part of what the future of insights will be. And then I think, where we started this whole conversation, right, about the power of data. I think there's no doubt that, the classic adage that data will be the new oil. But I think along with that is the recognition that, while data might be the crude oil, it's actually the human intelligence that will actually be the engine that turns that from theoretical power into actual momentum and opportunity for the business, right? So it's kind of pairing all of what that data is, plus, obviously all the technology that's layered on top of that, but then really understanding human behavior, everything we've learned in the last couple of decades about actually how the human brain works, how decisions are made, how memories are stored, all of that human sciences, I think, paired with the data, I think if we can connect those together, I think that will be a really powerful unlock.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a big topic these days. And in terms of ability and being able to, move more quickly and also like marry up, like, I guess, what's your balance of what can be done really quickly and with
Mhm.
technology and with AI versus where do you really want to spend your like mental energy,
Right.
making sense of it all.
Well, and I think that's where I almost like to think about like all the technology, back to the oil analogy for a minute, like all the technology becomes almost like your refinery, right? So it's the thing that enables you to move quickly from this crude oil to a product that you can actually use, right? So whether we're using artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever the approach is, but helping you quickly get from this sea of oil of like so many different data points, so many different things that you could look at to kind of quickly understand like what should I focus on? Like, so what are the big patterns? What are the big trends that are seeing? The things that, to your point, it would take a human being a lifetime to try and identify. And so quickly boiling that down to here are the key nuggets that you should actually go and dig into. But then I think the human intelligence piece is then the added value on top of that is digging into it and trying why do we think this is happening? What do we think is the human need or motivation behind this? How does this link with how we know, again, the brain operates or decisions are made? I think connecting those pieces together, and I think the human being the layer on top of that to really make sense of it and to make meaning from it from the business, because that's the piece that the AI and ML can't tell us. It can tell us what is happening. Again, it can very quickly help identify the patterns, but it can't really tell us why necessarily, or really tell us what to do about it. And so I think, that's really where the role, I think, insights and analytics comes into play, is the layering on top of that to really explain, understand, and then be able to action against the data.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, to connect that consumer problem with the business problem.
Exactly, right. And I think that does require still that kind of consultative mindset on top of what the data is telling you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been a fabulous chat. I've really enjoyed kind of hearing from you and, what your focus is on in terms of your approach to insights and innovation at Mondelez. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Great. I'm glad that we could make it happen, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for listening. Please remember to rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and we will be back next week with another episode. See you then.